Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues and friends. My name is Iveta Silova, and I am Professor and Associate Dean of Global Engagement at Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College at Arizona State University. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to our webinar organized in response to UNESCO's newly released report, Reimagining Our Futures Together, a New Social Contract for Education. We are thrilled to host today's discussion about the role of education in reimagining learning futures and rebuilding our relationships with each other, with the planet, and with technology. It is wonderful to see everybody here. Please take a minute to introduce each other in the chat and tell us where you are joining us from. Also, all of us are meeting virtually today. This event is hosted by Arizona State University, which is located in the Salt River Valley in Arizona, on the ancestral territories of indigenous peoples, including the Acamel, Autumn, and Peeposh Indian communities, whose care and keeping of these lands allows us to be here today. This webinar is a part of a larger initiative at Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College at ASU to launch Learning Futures Collaboratives in order to address complex issues and challenges facing education today and into the future by asking bigger questions from multiple interdisciplinary perspectives. We believe that research of this rigor, innovation, depth, and scale can only be achieved through collaboration among faculty and graduate students and among researchers and practitioners and across disciplines, cultures, and geopolitics. We have already started a series of collaborative, creative, and semi-hypothetical research conversations among our faculty and students. And to capture the momentum, we would like to extend this conversation to the global debates on the futures of education. We thought that the UNESCO's recent report presents a unique opportunity to do so. In fact, in preparation for the event, some of our faculty, students, and staff have written short commentaries on the report, and we will continue to exchange ideas after this webinar as well. You can check out these conversations by following the link in the chat. And just a reminder for our faculty and students, we are holding weekly office hours to discuss ideas related to the Learning Futures Collaboratives, and we will be releasing an RFP soon to get the collaboratives off the ground, so very exciting. Before introducing our speakers, I would like to welcome the Dean of Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College, Carol Basile, to share some opening remarks with us. Carol?
Thank you, Iveta, and thank you all for being here. This is really quite an opportunity for us and to learn more about the report, but also to really begin thinking about where we all need to head next. We are certainly in a moment. And we have been saying for a long time that if we don't take advantage of this, we don't see this as an opportunity, then this is a missed opportunity for us. So here at the Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College and ASU, we think about our charter of inclusivity. We think that our mission of actually getting to take action, to beginning thinking about the future of learning or learning futures is really very, very critical right now. This is not the time to be thinking about research as a solo researcher. This is a time to really think about how we work together, how we collaborate, how we use our interdisciplinary knowledge to create new things and new ways of thinking as we move further. The UNESCO report gives us a path for that. You will hear today not only about the report, but also the process of getting to the report. We were just having conversation about, what's included, what's not, decisions that were made, all of those kinds of things that I think are very, very important. And clearly, this couldn't have been a 500-page document. It could have been a 500-page document, but it's not. So lots of things, though, that I think are more than just food for thought here, things that we need to move forward on, things that we need to figure out how we're going to address these grand challenges of education in a much more future-forward direction. Arizona State University is known for being what we call a fifth wave university. We're a university that really puts our flag in the sand around how are we going to move forward, how do we create public value, and how do we see things moving ahead to make life better and make our communities better, society better for everyone. So with that, I just want to welcome everybody. Happy Valentine's Day. I think we're off and running. Thank you for being here and welcome.
Thank you so much, Carol. And now I'm thrilled to introduce our speakers who are joining us from different corners of the world. All of them have been closely involved, also in very different capacities, in shaping the UNESCO report about the futures of education or working towards implementation of the ideas in the report. David Edwards is Secretary General of Education International, a global union of teacher unions, joining us from Brussels in Belgium. Noah Sobe is splitting his time between Chicago and Paris. He is professor at Loyola University Chicago and senior officer at UNESCO's Futures of Education initiative. Inés Dussel is researcher and professor at the Department of Educational Research at the Center for Research and Advanced Studies of the National Polytechnic Institute, CINVESTAP in Mexico City. And Peter Desouza is a visiting professor at Goa University and a former faculty member at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies in New Delhi, India, who is joining us today from India. We will organize the discussion today in a format of a roundtable with a series of short remarks by each of the guests focused around three larger questions. Each panelist will have about 3-4 minutes to respond. And we will then open the floor for the audience to ask the questions. We hope that we'll have about half an hour for the discussion of other questions as well. So please share your questions in the Q&A, but we'd like to encourage you to also use chat to share your thoughts, reflections, and reactions to the conversation. So let's make it a much broader conversation and debate that's not only online with the speakers, but also in the chat room as well. So welcome everybody once again, especially our panelists, and we'll start with the first question. Over the last 2 years, UNESCO has catalyzed a really impressive global debate on how education, learning, and knowledge need to be reimagined in a world of increasing complexity, uncertainty, and fragility. Around 2 million people took part in this global consultation in various formats, from writing background papers to participating in workshops and webinars to creating art and many other ways of participation, pulling together an incredibly rich tapestry of ideas, which then was shaped into the report. Now that the report has finally been published, what do you think are the blind spots in current research in contributing to the work of reimagining learning futures? What are the issues that the report could have addressed but had not? And is there anything that was discussed in these deliberations but did not make it in the report that you find important? And we'll start our roundtable conversation with Noah, who was perhaps most directly involved in writing the report.
Thanks, Iveta, and thanks, Carol, and everyone who's put this together. It's great to be having this conversation. So taking up your first question, Iveta, what are some of the shortcomings, blind spots in current research? Well, one is clear in the way you asked the question. You talked about reimagining learning futures in the plural. So let's just begin by noting that that's, I think, an important difference from some of the literature out there, which talks about a future of education, a single future of learning. So as people have caught, embedded in the UNESCO project is a commitment to multiple futures of education, both as a reality and as something that's desired. Recognizing that we share a common world and we have an intertwined destiny. So that's the first thing I think that some current research overlooks, is that it projects singular futures for everyone too often from a single point on the planet. The second thing I would say, though, is, I think in general, a lot of education scholarship and thinking tends to be more reactive and adaptive than it needs to be. And it is important to envision possible futures, anticipated futures, think about what is predicted. And obviously our education systems, our practices do need to react and adapt. But in focusing solely on that, we miss and we discount the ability of education to shape the future. So that, I think, is the second sort of major thing I would raise about kind of a current blind spot, is that we too often discount the ability of education to make alternative desirable futures. Just real quickly, a final thought, and then I'll yield to others. When you look around today and in movies and TV shows, I'm always struck by the number of dystopian stories that are out there, and those are useful. Dystopian futures are very useful because they warn us about what we don't want, right? May even contain some suggestions on how to avoid those futures. But at the same time, we need positive visions of futures. And I would characterize this UNESCO report as a positive visioning exercise, that asks, what is the world we want and how can education help us move in that direction?
Thank you, Noah, so much. And Inés, we'll move over to you now.
So I was thinking lots of things with your question, but first thing I would say, current research maybe is too big a term. Educational research is a vibrant field, it's really plural, lots of institutions, different scholarly traditions. I come from Mexico and Argentina, Latin America. Maybe the discussions we have in research are different, but I would say, yes, there is a mainstream research, I would say, and it's mostly shaped by Anglo journals, Anglo institutions, and I think it's generally organized around the lines of what is there and less around what could be thought differently. As Noah was saying, I agree with him that it's mostly reactive and adaptive. And I think what we see also in Mexico, in Argentina, sometimes there is also a lack of risk-taking, a lack of intellectual ambition in research. It's, I would say, maybe even more bureaucratic. Stay with your own certainties, do your career, do your trajectory, and not engage too much with the world or with things that are not clear, no, that are not, yes, black and white. So I would say it's not so much an issue of themes or topics, if I have to speak about blind spots, but more about positions and approaches. And I was thinking when in the pandemic, as I was helping my stepdaughter to do some homework, she had to work on the Russian Revolution, and we came across a very interesting story about Jacques Sadoul. Jacques Sadoul was the French envoy to military attaché agrégé to the Russian embassy, and so he gets there in the middle of the revolution, and he has a wonderful journal of these days, and he says, I don't know what will happen tomorrow, and I don't know what to wish. He later becomes a communist, but at that moment he's just a witness and he's documenting, and it's so wonderful because he's not writing from a dogmatic position. He's just trying to see what is going on, and I think this is the kind of sensibility we need, more of a witness, more of a documentation, more of a walking along, thinking along, and not alone, thinking with others. And I think, yes, less the idea of designing the future, engineering the future, and more this idea of walking along and staying with the travel. That's also another idea I like a lot. No, and I think that's something I would like to shift from this position of educational research has to know how things are and maybe stay with the travel. No?
Inés, thank you so much for these comments. We'll move over to Peter now.
Right, thank you very much. I'll sort of adopt a slightly different take, because I think before we come to the specifics of how we would like to sort of suggest research agendas, I'd like to spend a minute or so talking about the making of the report, because in many ways the making of the report had to participate in this exercise of what is to be included and what is to be excluded. And because we had an intense 7 to 8 month weekly brainstorming, many items came on the agenda. If I may, I'm not going to go through the sort of list of items that were finally included, because the report itself has done an admirable job of not just listing all the issues, but discussing them, fair degree of clarity. But I think one thing that we must keep in mind, especially since I see that we're speaking to a global community, is that there was a continuous tension between concerns of the global north and concerns of the global south. Many of the issues on what educational thinking and educational research needs to do, in many ways in the global south, constitute an unfinished agenda of an earlier period. Security for girls in schools, more access, more quality education, all the stuff that's already out there, but becomes very urgent in the global south. Many of the concerns of the global north had to do with the digital landscape. What is the digital landscape doing to the school? What is it doing to work? What is it doing to the classroom? What is it doing to learning processes? And the challenge of the report was to sort of align these two discourses, both important, one no less important than the other, because we were talking about futures, and in many ways, both the north and the south were staring out at these futures. So I think the report in many ways achieves this exercise admirably, and many of the items that you expect in this question of what we would need to research is out there. But I'd still like to add a few more things to the discussion. One is, you see, when one thinks about research agendas in the global south, one tends to, the blind spot that one tends to have is that one tends to ignore the asymmetries of discourse, of knowledge flow from the north to the south. And very often, a lot of policy making in the global south is determined by debates and discourses taking place in the global north. So if you talk in terms of privatization of education, privatization of education comes into the global south because policymakers, World Bank, and what have you, have made that the new normal. Have made that the kind of the credo of policy making. But that has huge implications. So this asymmetry of knowledge, I think, is an important thing that institutions such as yours and communities such as those who gathered around this webinar need to explore. What are these asymmetries doing to policy making, particularly in the global south? How much of those cultural baggages, how much of those implicit values, how much of those givens become part of our thinking? If you were to sort of give it one word, the term which has become fairly fashionable is decolonizing knowledge. How much of that? How much of that do we need to participate in? The second, and this is of course fairly universal, is I would like to see more engagement with the question of ethics particularly because of the huge advances in science and technology today. I mean, everything about us is today being impacted by science and technology, and a lot of it has ethical implications. Not enough discussion accompanies these advances, and certainly the place to begin is in the realm of education. I have more to say, but I think I'll come back to that. Thank you.
That's wonderful. Such great comments from everybody so far. And David, now it's over to you.
Thanks, Iveta. Nice to be with you as well. Always great to be with ASU. Thank you. Listen, my colleagues have said a lot of things that I wanted to say in terms of, I don't know about you, but sometimes I get sort of overwhelmed. I get sort of fatigued with reports and commissions, and this commission and that commission and that report, and you're trying to remember which commission was set up to do which thing. The difference with this commission, and what I always say I like about it, is it doesn't start with a blueprint, do this. It starts with an invitation based on principles and based on a vision, like Noah said, the world we want. We still have to deal with the world we don't want, but we still have to answer the question about what is the world that we do want. I think in terms of current research right now, one of the problems that, from our perspective as teachers, that really inhibits research doing meaningful things is the fact that there are certain wrong drivers that are there right now in terms of when there's funding available for research, what kind of research is that? Who funds research? To what end? If it's all have to be sort of, massive quantitative, with trying to look at rates of return so that you can answer a simple question, right? And that's where the money's going, then everyone's going to run to that. And there will be a discount. There will be things that are discounted on the other side. And what happens is then the money issue becomes a turf issue, because you have scarcity, you have a paucity of resources, and then you have a breakdown of what should be an intersectoral approach within our field, within discipline, across disciplines, trying to say, but where's my language stuff? Where's my health stuff? Where's my this stuff? Where's my that stuff? Instead of seeing the interconnectivity of those. In the teaching profession, we see that in terms of the conditions for teaching and learning, also with the conditions for employment and the way we work. So I think that's also a major challenge. And one of the things I really also like in the report, which is a gap that we have, which is a humility gap. Prior to, and it's all throughout the report, and I love it, the pedagogy of humility, the ethics of humility. Right before the pandemic, and I'll be brief, before the pandemic, I was at one of these things that we're all on, and there was some tech company there with a bunch of people saying, just imagine the future where we don't need teachers, we don't need schools, all students can be at home learning on a screen. Isn't that fantastic? It's a little ironic 2 years later to think that was being pitched as the desirable future. So I think some humility being injected in, particularly to those that were pushing those agendas and were really, promising big, seeing what we've seen, understanding what we see. Now it's up to the rest of us. And I think the other part of is to think about research in a different way in terms of building those linkages and those connections between practitioners and researchers and students and communities, and making sure that there's a resource base where they are able to go and explore and to further without having to take each other out and to further just divide and cut each other down to get that little bit for their turf. So I think those are at a macro level. I have more to say, but I think those are my first impressions around the sort of blind spots and challenges we have.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I just wanted to encourage everybody to, you can play further with these ideas in the chat. Feel free to, post your own reactions, commentaries on everything that's being said and discussed so far. And please also share your questions in the Q&A because we will have time to have a few other rounds of discussions around the questions that you pose as well. But I will move on to our next question, which is a little bit more playful, but also I think very difficult at the same time. And so if this report was a movie, who do you think would be the main heroes and villains in this movie? And what implications would this have for research? So we'll shift the order of responses right now a little bit. And actually we'll start with Inés, if you don't mind.
I will not. I have to say I'm quite happy with the report. I mean, I think you can do what you can do, and I think it did a lot. I think national agendas are still very important at UNESCO, and it is good that there is a common arena where there can be negotiations, but also I think the commissions were very good at bringing other actors as well, not only national actors. And I think, and I get to the villains, but I would say that what is advanced, what is advocated for in the report is related to the commons, to this idea of working together in a really polarized world, in a world in which people don't want to talk to each other. We have to reimagine our futures together. We have to take care of the planet. We have to think about better infrastructures of the public and what we want to do as human beings, and not only as human beings, also give the planet some voice, a planetary voice. So which are the villains in the report? I'm not sure about the report, but I would say for me, the villains would be around PISA and the reduction of education to what Biesta calls learnification. I think that is a huge reduction and that it has get us where we are now, I would say, in terms of a bureaucratic system, in terms of, yes, these kind of preachers of the future and no way out. So I would say, for me, this is one of the villains that we should, and of course, there are valuable people at PISA, and PISA gives us lots of data, but I would say what it has done to educational systems, they have gone in terms of more individualism, more competitiveness, and not really trying to be interested and engaged with the world in which we live. And I would also say, for me, another villain would be, and I hope I'm not, I will not, how do you say? Well, I don't, for me, we have another problem coming in the future, and it's already here, which is neuroscience, no? Because I think neuroscience now appears to be like the great foreseer, the great designer of the world. And I think, of course, we need science. There is no discussion about that. But I think how neuroscience is brought in terms of trying to govern and maximize cognition and knowledge, even monetize cognition and knowledge, and how neuroscience is working aligned with artificial intelligence and corporations, I think that is a problem. That is a big problem. And I think this idea, as David was saying, these people that think we don't need teachers, we don't need students, actually, you will get a chip implanted. And so, no, this chip will give you all the learning you need. No? And I think we need to discuss this. I mean, of course, humans have changed. And I think the boundaries between nature and society, nature and technology are shifting all the time. But I would say, at least we need to have public discussions about this. And today we don't have them. We don't have enough of these discussions. No, it's more of a proprietary knowledge that is also related to corporations that are working with business models, but they are not thinking about the common good necessarily. No, so I think we need to discuss this. For me, these are things that concern me, that worry me a lot.
Thank you, Inés. And well, this will be very interesting. I'm really looking forward to hear the other responses as well. Peter, we will move over to you now.
Again, yes, I think one of the great things of the report is that in addition to sort of identifying trends and deficits, it also put forward certain key concepts that it invites us to think about and debate. And one of the concepts that I found particularly exciting, and I got a chance to sort of research it in more depth, was the idea of the knowledge commons. I say this because particularly in the digital world that we exist in, there's this tension between the knowledge commons and the privatization of the knowledge commons. There's a continuous tension. So the knowledge commons is a concept with a huge amount of potential. And I think it's something that we need to not only take the idea of the commons from the Ostrom debate, because that was in terms of the natural commons, but bring it into the domain of education. Because not only does it meet all the criteria of what a commons is in terms of non-excludability, non-subtractability, but it gives non-subtractability new dimensions, because not only does use of the commons not diminish what is available to others, it enriches what is available to others. That's what knowledge does. So yes, so one of the great things about the report is to put out this idea, in addition to the ideas of public good, which we debated in great detail. In fact, I must put it on the table, is this idea of the knowledge commons. Now, why do I foreground this as, why am I using that as a preface to identifying my villain? Because I think we are seeing in the world around us many attempts at enclosure. Classical, like the classical enclosure movement in the commons in the UK, in the world of knowledge, there are enclosure movements taking place. And these enclosure movements are very damaging to the growth of knowledge. I mean, classic example is the research that went into the COVID vaccine. Pfizer teamed up with the German company Biotech. Biotech got a huge amount of funding, public funding, and yet the patent for the vaccine remained private, and huge resistance to making the technology available to large parts of the world. You know, even if millions get the virus, it's all right, but we are not going to dismantle the enclosure movement that we've created, which is called the patent regime and property rights. So I think the enclosure movement, and this happens in IT, this happens in biotech, this happens in neuroscience, it happens in all the cutting edge dimensions of scientific development. So that's one of the villains. The other villain, I think, is and I think this is also very significant, because while it was discussed in the report and while we debated how much space to give it, I would have liked to see more space, but I'm very happy that it found mention, is the existence of new knowledge centers produced by global capital. Global capital today has, in a sense, taken over running of universities. I don't know what it's like in ASU, but power has shifted from the academy to the manager. Power has shifted from public funds to private philanthropy, and you see this very much in the Ivy League, and that model has now begun to replace universities in other parts of the world. The Humboldtian University, in a sense, has been severely undermined. So that's a villain. I mean, the logic of global capital is beginning to displace the university as a major center of knowledge and hand over that knowledge to private consultancies. So if you look at the huge growth, and there is a nexus, the Ivy League sends all its star pupils to the global consultancies, and the global consultancies now advise government on what needs to be done. Policy making is not being, universities have stopped being the center of policy making. Now, I'm overgeneralizing, of course, but I'd like to present it there as and the third villain, and this is serious because I think we again tend to undermine it. And again, speaking from my corner of the woods, is nationalism. Nationalism is severely impacting curricula. Textbooks are being written with nationalist objectives. Professional historians are being, for example, history. Professional historians are in South Asia are being diminished, and ideological replaced by ideological careerists. So nationalism is it's also happening in the United States. I mean, the teaching of creationism in Texas schools, or the critical race theory, the whole resistance to critical race theory that you see in the US. There are parallels in other parts of the world. I mean, so I think that's a villain. I mean, nationalism is no friend of education. It wants to use education for political purposes. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Dave, we'll go over to you next.
You listening to these things and you go, yeah, that would be my villain, and I could go further on that. But I think on Inés's point about learnification and reductionism, that's certainly a villain for us and for me. I was really pleased that in terms of a hero, that the word solidarity was used, and pedagogy of solidarity, and no one knows what I'm talking about, but it's, for a very long time, it was folks in our movement that used it pretty. We even have a song about it. We use it quite frequently, and it's something that's very hard to explain to some types of sort of private market folks who are always looking at sort of, but what's your individual return on that action, and trying to explain, no, it's a collective return. It's solidarity. We do it because it's solid. But how much are you charging for? How much do you bill for that? What's the overhead for that? And it's very difficult to be able to. So if you see a world where human beings are basically evil and you have to manipulate them to do what you want them to do, and because you have power, you do want them to do things that benefit you in that world, it's very hard to make sense of a pedagogy of solidarity. And I think that shift, which is there, but it's a tension, right? Because that sort of authoritarian populism that Peter's talking about, really finds itself quite nicely attached to some of these types of ideas around sort of the market fundamentalism, and they go together. It's sort of an unholy alliance in many ways, but it's there in many places. It's very repressive. It's very oppressive, and to be able to kind of have a space and talk about what you want education to do, despite that, I think is heroic. However, it requires more than words, and it requires actually mobilization and organizing and understanding that these are systems, and that systems are built to do what systems are built to do. And if you want to, they deliver on their intent, and you want to change them, you have to change the system. So if you're looking at asymmetries in resourcing and tax and power and trade, if you're looking at IP and copyright, these are systems that are made to do that and to reproduce that if you want to lift the innovations of the global South. Now, one of the things I would also say in my mind in terms of like those characters is purpose. So purpose was something that really came out strongly. And also for us as educators, we don't do assessment for the sake of ranking our students and finding the bad ones. We assess students all the time because we want them to improve. My colleagues that are in educational measurement and other things, hopefully many assess education systems because they want to inform a decision that will improve something. However, the villain side of it is ease of use, or they call it efficiency, but the purpose is control, not purpose. And the organizing principle is around control. And I think that's a villain that we very much have to wrestle power away from. And I don't think it's one that's going to go easy too, whether that's control about what is whose knowledge, how that's produced, how that's understood, all of those questions. I think it's a villain, but it's one that, I read it because I also read the report knowing some of the background stuff that's happening out and around. So I can say, I bet this was such and such group wanted this, or so-and-so wouldn't have handled it if gotten that far, right? So those tensions are there. And that's what the next step of the report comes in. So when the Secretary General and the Transforming Education Summit and all these world leaders come together to say, okay, we're going to reimagine education. What are we going to do about it? That's where we all have to sort of mobilize researchers, educators, students, and everyone else to be able to put forward that vision and actually say, and this is what needs to happen to achieve that vision. So I think it's important to have the vision, obviously.
Thank you, Dave. No, I'm curious to hear from you now too. What are you going to add to the list?
Well, I think people have mentioned a lot of heroes and villains that I would also mention. Inés talked about the commons, David, solidarity. Maybe I'll just pick up on the notion of together in the title, reimagining our futures together, which is, to, on the one hand, to just recognize our interdependencies as a kind of fact of the world. So like, I think COVID has underscored this. I mean, together is a reality. Of course, it's also got an aspirational dimension because we need to get a lot better at working together, right? And that's the pedagogies of collaboration and solidarity. And that's one of the areas where I think the report is actually taking a pretty strong stand on needing to reset, as David put it, some of the purposes of education. One of my elevator speeches is, think about it for a second. You have these places where you bring 20, 30, 40, 50, sometimes more people together to learn, with and from each other. Okay. Yet for the most part, all we do is measure and value individual accomplishment. What a huge wasted opportunity, right? And when we think about the challenges in front of us, we definitely need to get better at working together. So I think that's a clear hero of the report. I think agreement on all the villains that have been mentioned. Maybe I'll just add, the relentless pursuit of growth. is one of the clear villains in the report. I mean, when we think about destruction to the environment, when we think about the climate crisis, you know, clearly our commitments, our human commitments to, you know, continuing to grow are very responsible. But I think, you know, we also need to look inside ourselves in education and ask, you know, in what ways are schools contributing? Certainly not solely responsible, but what are the possible ways schools are culpable in some of these problems? And one of the things that I think the report calls out quite well is just, I mean, even looking, you know, within education, you know, if our goal is to just do everything like more and more efficiently, you know, that is heading us towards a cliff as much as anything else. You know, that is tied to, you know, viewing education in purely human capital terms, which I think is absolutely the wrong. I mean, I think 50 plus years of that have shown, one, that it's not working. Two, it's definitely not working as a political strategy to get more funding. So, I mean, if that's what we go to, you know, well, this is how we can strengthen the sector. That hasn't worked particularly well. You know, and I actually think this has a lot of implications for education research, right? So, I mean, just a quick observation, maybe to get something off my chest. I'm really bothered when we measure COVID learning loss in terms of lost future income. I mean, come on. Like, we have suicide rates, you know, that are higher than ever. We have a mental health problem among kids and adolescents, and not just adolescents, you know, that's a real problem. And to go measuring it in terms of, you know, 2.3 billion lost in earnings for a generation is just, frankly, you know, disgusting.
Excellent. There is also really wonderful discussion going on in the chat on the villains and heroes, and people are adding more to the list, which is really excellent. So when you have a moment, please check that as well. But we'll continue with another round of questions that we prepared, and then we'll open it to the questions that are rolling in big time right now in the Q&A as well. So thank you everybody for participating and asking difficult questions. But we wanted to add, to have a space for all of the panelists today, for our guests to also speak from their own disciplinary perspectives and ask, what do you think should be priorities and the most urgent tasks for research in terms of advancing and learning the future's agenda, whether in terms of the adequacy of our vocabularies, theories, methods, practices, movements, educating new researchers, or just simply ways of being as academics more broadly. So that's an opportunity maybe to kind of anchor in your own academic professional fields to reflect on these questions. And we'll shuffle it around again a little bit, and Peter, we'll start with you.
Thank you. I mean, this is going to be a sort of very partisan starting point, because I come to the discussion as a political scientist, and I come from a region of the world which has very serious concerns. So my as a political scientist speaking on education, my first recommendation is for a greater allocation from state budgets for education. What we are seeing today is a privatization of education. And that is not only producing two classes of people, but it's impoverishing public education. Public education in the schools, the public education in universities. And over time, that's just going to produce it's going to produce a whole elite that will have seceded from the politics and dynamics of a transforming society. So as a political scientist, I'm very concerned about that. I'm very concerned about the decreasing allocations in percentage terms for education, school and higher education. The second is, I think educational institutions must have greater autonomy. There's much too much government control in education. So vice chancellors are partisan people. They increasingly heads of institutions genuflect to the ruling ideology. And that's not good, because great institutions that have been built with a kind of enlightenment idealism of the founding, and I'm speaking very much from South Asia. Great institutions that were built because they emerged from an enlightenment romanticism, that we need to invest in knowledge production, and that knowledge production will, in a sense, address many of the concerns of our society, whether this is poverty, the development concerns, or whether it is in terms of what was considered at that time a certain backwardness of mind and practice. So these institutions came up. They produced good scholarship, both in the natural and applied sciences, as well as increasingly these institutions are being controlled by government. So government, not only is it is there a shortage of funding, but there is a sense that we are doing you a favor and therefore you must dance to our tune. So that's my second concern as a political scientist. And third is, we need to strengthen debates within the humanities, because it's extremely worrying that our public discourse, and this is true of the global north as well, has been hijacked by partisan and nationalist thinking. I mean, it's a huge despair for people like me who watch advanced and OECD countries in the global north, United States, England, having a public discourse that is so partisan, that is so adversarial, that sort of submits to what I call the politics of othering, and it resonates. It has a constituency. It creates a constituency. I would like to see a public discourse which is much more critical, much more plural, much more enabled, without having to fear challenging authority and challenging both authority of the state but an authority of society as well. There's a lot of vulnerabilities today in the public discourse, and as a political scientist, that worries me, because it diminishes our democracy, it diminishes our commitment to these larger values, all of which are so ably and so beautifully captured in the humanist tone and tenor of the report. Yeah, Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter, for these thoughtful comments. Dave, we'll turn over the mic to you now.
Yeah, I was thinking, what discipline am I? So I have studied international education policy for a long time, and I also look at it through a couple of different lenses. But I think I'll use the sort of labor and teacher lens when I'm thinking about this right now. One of the things that I think moving forward is that we need to be thinking about teachers as researchers. I think we need to have a frame in our minds, and we need to make sure that there are resources, there are time for teachers to be able to do that. And you can't really get around that unless you build it into the agreements that define the use of their time. And you can't really do that unless you realize and recognize the rights that they have to have a voice in a lot of these matters and these issues. And we at EI, we do a lot of research, obviously, with our member organizations who do research themselves. They do research across organizations, both in the global north and global south. There's a lot of work that's being done to look right now at issues around teacher well-being and burnout. Noah rightly talks about the fact that we're losing kids, and that's much more distressing than losing GDP. We're losing teachers. We're losing, the report mentions it, touches on it, but you're in the country where you're sitting, that's 55% have said they're going to leave the profession. That's more than half in a teaching education school. So We have a massive challenge, and it's not just in the US, it's worldwide. Our status research survey is picking this up all over. Burnout, we have strikes going on, not because they don't want to teach during COVID, but because they simply have any information about what mitigation strategies. There's no substitute teachers for them. They don't have laptops. They don't have access to internet. They don't know, parents call them all night. They're worried about the kids that Noah was talking about. Their students who are committing suicide at higher rates. We need to be able to tap into that wisdom, not just knowledge, but wisdom, because it does bring the values piece in with the experience and the knowledge, and sort of lift that up and look at opportunities to partner, I think, with teachers and their unions, there's organizations around those conditions to make sure that we can sustain and deliver on those. I think the other issues that we see our members are really challenged by is the issue around big data. That comes out, I think, is one of the villains, the sort of the platform capital issue. They're seeing huge challenges there. No one wants to talk about what's inside the algorithm. We're talking about ethics. We're talking about AI. We're talking about it was somebody I think Noah brought to a UNESCO conference once that I heard say it's about the strip mining of human intention, right? Which is absolutely antithetical to why teachers are in their profession. And they are seeing their students being bombarded with social media, with messages. They're seeing them go down. They're seeing kids who have anorexia problems just being bombarded with information more and more about, body shaming stuff, suicide, the same kinds of things. And we now know that those platforms are doing it on purpose, right? So we need to research that. We need to not just research that. We need to shine a light on that. I think there's a lot of different opportunities to work across democracy movements, across that are with the journalists. I think education should also be looking at like what's happening in terms of whistleblowers, what's happening in terms of media literacy, what's happening, a lot of other different places to be able to get out in front of what's going on. But I think from my disciplinary side, I would make a plea that research that is created in classrooms by teachers, for teachers, with teachers and their students for that benefit is still research that is valid and important. And it is not sort of, it's no less important than something that has some sort of high scalability metric on words per minute, right? You guys knew I would get that in there, didn't you? Anyway, that was just some of my thinking.
It's awesome, Dave. Thank you so much. Noah, over to you now.
Thanks. Like Dave, I'm in international education policy, and Iveta like in the field of comparative education. I think disciplinarily, I would call myself a historian of education. That's my training. So I mean, you may ask, what's a historian of education doing anything with the future, which I get pressed on, and my answer is, I think historians, maybe more than some other disciplines, know how things have been and could be different. Kind of know how the categories and the lenses that we have come to us through particular trajectories and with particular baggage. Peter talked about some of that earlier. In terms of what this means for the task of research, I think about the major calls in the report related to the school curriculum, right? Which are, we need to move away from, thinking of school subjects in kind of this grid-like manner and think about intercultural, interdisciplinary, ecological learning. And what ties those three things together is a concern with thinking less in terms of categories and more in terms of connections, right? And I think that's maybe something we could infuse into our research more generally. The second thing, although I wanted to mention, builds a little bit off what David was saying about teachers, and ASU, of course, is really involved in studying the future of the teaching profession. But maybe just to highlight the importance of thinking about teaching in the first place. I do appreciate that this is titled, learning futures, but let's not forget about teaching futures. It's a wonderful, beautiful thing that human beings can learn. But it's also a wonderful, beautiful thing that human beings can teach one another. And God knows we need some of that right now. And just some thought in our research, and maybe this sounds a little bit old school, but to think about the way that education is embedded in intergenerational relationships, and the concerns of justice that need to drive those relationships. So how we set up, what we owe, what we take forward, and what other people will take forward, I think needs to be at the core of our research and education. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Excellent, really, really interesting insights from all of you. And thanks again to everybody for commenting in the chat as well. I hope that the panelists also have a chance to read some of these great comments. But we'll move now into our Q&A session, and we'll take some of the questions from the audience. We have quite a few that are rolling in, and I'll try to summarize some of them and maybe link some of them together to make sure that we can cover as much as possible. And I'll start with kind of a couple of questions that are all around this kind of notion of this UNESCO report being positioned as not a blueprint, right? Like not providing a very specific guide on what to do next, right? And on the one hand, it's definitely, seen as a openness for flexibility, right? And for diverse thinking and diverse implementation. But then on the other hand, also could be seen as maybe not leading to action, right? That's one of the critiques. And so we have a couple of questions around kind of these ideas, but more, from the perspective of kind of different ideas that are brought up in the report that seems to be really innovative, but it's not clear how to move forward with them. And so Esther Preddy, for example, is asking about, in the research, in this report, you mentioned the idea of multi-species relations and collaborations, shifting the focus of education away from human exceptionalism and into the modern human world relations. But how do you envision that shift in practice? Because the report mentions concepts, but does not delve deeper into how these could be implemented through the new social contract. And we have a similar question from kind of along the same line from Bear Rodriguez Franzen, who's asking, how do you reconcile collaborations that the report is really pushing for, but that has to be implemented in the systems that values competitiveness, right? So just if you could address any of these issues, I think that could be interesting. And please, the others, keep sending your questions and we'll try to squeeze them in the discussion as well. Not sure who would like to start with this one, or if all of you want to answer it. Any volunteers?
I think Noah should take the whole thing about, you have a framework of action that comes out of Incheon, right, and the world, and then you have this, which is a very different purpose, and I think they should be confused. I think the world's governments and civil society, a lot of folks got together, spent a whole lot of time trying to figure out, and a number of us were fighting for free public education in that document, got it. When a lot of people wanted it to be affordable, and a certain sector was pushing it for it to be affordable learning, not free. So I'll let Noah pick up that one. I just wanted to say something about, I said before about the wrong drivers, and I know that it's Hargreaves and others have written about this, and I see some people in the chat that have written a lot of stuff that I read too. So and we have this situation right now of competition, and we had the whole value added fight, right? Remember the value added fight where where, you know, how cows produce milk was then translated to our profession in terms of the value of a teacher. So instead of teachers wanting to share with each other what they are doing, it was a privatization, not just an exogenous, but an endogenous privatization of keeping stuff to myself, because if I can get these kids to learn more, same thing with universities, same thing with organizations, where you're not incentivizing, if we go in the economic space, you're not incentivizing people to share. You're not creating a commons. You're not creating any kind of collective vision. And why is that? Because you don't share a common vision of what you're trying to do. You haven't structured or designed systems that allow for teams of people to be recognized and to benefit and to learn from each other, because it's not easy. And that I talk about the control versus purpose. That's purpose-driven organizations. That's where you want to be. That's the quadrant you want to be in. And I really think my personal view on this is, when people have collective power, maybe through a union, you have an opportunity to be able to get a better bargain and to negotiate a social contract that includes those types of things, and not just a race to the bottom where everyone's after each other, taking each other down. Just a thought on that one.
Yeah, if I could follow quickly, just to say, I mean, in the simplest terms, you know, we need to think together to act together. And that's what this report is calling for. So it's a call for ongoing dialogue and action. You know, it's not a roadmap. It's not a blueprint. I think that our searches for blueprints have done more damage than good. You know, David put it well. I mean, you've got to be driven by people coming together around purpose. They're both, I mean, they're really good questions. I mean, how do you embed sort of a different consciousness and relationship to Earth, to the living planet Earth, to the natural world, to other species? I actually think that's an area where the report gets into some pretty granular detail. You know, we frame a lot of learning in classrooms as learning about the planet Earth, right? You know, it's this object. You know, Iveta's done tons of work on this, and I recognize lots of names on this in the participants list, you know, people who are experts on this. But we that's ripe for reframing. You know, it's not easy, but it's not impossible. And, you know, implementing cooperation in a system that values competition. Challenge, and we can look outside of education and, you know, complain about competition in our societies, but we can also ask ourselves, like, what are we doing that propels that competition forward, and how can we change that? You know, pushing back against, you know, the outcomes of PISA, as both David and Inés talked about. Peter, maybe too, I think, is one way. But then also how we think about competitions, you know, in simple things of our teaching. I think we'll have some value. I don't know. Over to others.
Thanks so much, Noah. Peter, you had your hand up, and then Inés.
Yes, I'd like to sort of take this forward, but you know, at a tangent perhaps, because while I accept what David and Noah have said in terms of an overemphasis on competition and individuality, and not enough on collaboration and cooperation, that's true. But I want to make the additional point that, you know, actually there is a lot of collaboration and cooperation, but we don't see it. We don't see it because the discourse has blinded us to that. Let me give you a very recent example, which in a sense brings this out, or two examples. One of the most significant scientific developments of the last couple of months is the launching of the James Webb Telescope. Right, for 30 years, huge teams of scientists, and you know, you can think of people from material science to people working on optics to people working with large computer systems, all came together to position a telescope which has never been done before, millions of miles away from Earth. And this was done collaboratively. There's not a single name that you can list. The people that headed the project have thanked the teams of scientists. But when that is done, it's seen as a scientific endeavor. It's not seen as the production of a commons. It's not seen as the result of cooperation and collaboration and all the things. And a lot of what is happening today gets presented in this very limited way, as if it's just the product of science. Take for example, in the domain of medical science. Again, in the last 2 months, there have been 2 fantastic experiments that have taken place. One in NYU Langone, and the other in the University of Maryland Medical Center. Both of them involved organ transplant. And the organs that were used was, in one case, a kidney from a pig to see if it could perform in a brain-dead person, and it did. It did produce urine and waste. And the other is the transplantation of a heart from a pig to a human being. In both cases, the people who were part of the team, and this involved a large team of doctors, scientists, medical professionals, etc., did so collaboratively. But again, it doesn't get named. So while on the one hand, I agree that yes, we need to challenge a certain framing of which is seen in terms of individual, etc. The other is to challenge a certain deliberate blindness that the system reproduces and reproduces. We need to be able to talk about these other things without which science would not develop. In the Large Hadron Collider, the Large Hadron Collider requires huge teams of scientists. I'm giving examples from the cutting edge of science. You see, I'm not giving examples which everyday management of commerce or whatever. From cutting edge of science, and yet these are not seen as the production of knowledge which is collaborative and cooperative and can only happen because a whole lot of people come together and share their knowledge and take it forward. So I think both things need to be done, not just challenging a certain framing, but also challenging the blindness that framing produces. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. Ines, would you like to add something too?
Yes, I agree with what has been said, and I was thinking about what Peter said. Lots is going on already, and I think schools are also a place in which there have been lots of solidarity networks, and I think many teachers and many students have been mostly concerned with well-being in the last 2 years. And I think you are right, these other forms of solidarity, of producing the commons, are not being visibilized by the discourse, for example, on learning losses and what has been learned during the pandemic. What did we learn as human beings, as part of this planet? I don't know. I think there are lots very, very interesting things going on there. I was recently reading Veena Das, an Indian anthropologist whose work I find really fascinating, and she's talking about inordinate knowledge. So these are the modalities of knowing that are related to being in the world. And she says, perhaps this is the most important knowledge, not necessarily the one that is clear and, if you want, curricular knowledge, but this region of knowledge in which you learn how to live and to be in the world and how to deal with trauma, with violence, and how to make sense of this world. I think education is all about that. And I think in the pandemic, this has been really important. And I think we have to document it. We have to think about it, to theorize it. What does it say about research? What does it say about the curriculum? How do we make room for this? How do we train teachers and researchers to make room for this? And I think in that respect, there's a lot of things we need to do. And there is an agenda, and I agree also with Noah. We need to think of the learning futures together with the teaching futures, and maybe educational futures, if you want, and education as this place of international conversations are very important.
Excellent. We have a few more questions. We can try another round of discussion. I'm not sure we'll have time for 2 rounds, but I'll try to combine a couple of questions here. One is, there are a couple of questions kind of on the adequacy of the existing vocabularies and systems and how we work around those. And so a question, for example, from Jill Koyama is kind of questioning whether the vocabulary we use right now, such as the global north or global south terminology, which is descriptively inaccurate, homogenizing, deterministic, whether you see any value in continuing to use it, and kind of how do we work around that. There are several questions around kind of the systems, including the funding systems, and how do we work around those as well. So do you have any thoughts on these questions? Anyone?
Maybe I'll start, because I think the global north, global south was my vocabulary, and I recognize the common criticism that these are huge categories within which there are pluralities. So is it still useful to talk of global north and global south as if they're homogeneous? I think the use of those categories is, first of all, essentially a political usage, in the sense that when one talks of the global south, one uses it as a contrast with the global north, recognizing that in both of these categories there are internal pluralities. In fact, global north and global south is not a geographic category. It's an epistemic category. So even in the so-called geographical north, there is an epistemic south. There is a global south. And the same is true of in the geographic south, there is still a north. So these are epistemic categories, and we can define these epistemic categories by identifying certain properties of exclusion, of oppression, of suppression, of inequality, etc. So if you recognize that these are epistemic categories, then I think in many ways the generalization carries less of a burden than the critics want to impose on it. So that's my response. While I concede, yes, there is, but the purpose is political, because in the absence of that, in the absence of using such large categories, you would not be able to talk in terms of heroes and villains. If you want to talk of heroes and villains, then you need to have heroes who have certain qualities, and villains who have other qualities. So we need to. I mean, that's a conceptual risk that you take.
Thank you, Peter. Noah?
Just to come in real quick, I mean, I think Peter put it well. I mean, it's perhaps serves a useful political purpose. So Inés and Peter were part of the kind of a consultant group that helped frame, and there are dozens more. David and EI were part of an advisory group to the commission. David mentioned, some of the webinars we put together, but this is 2 years of amazing conversations that, as Iveta mentioned in the opening, drew in over 1 million people. But one in particular, including meetings with the International Commission, right, that authored this independent report, chaired by the President of Ethiopia. And one thing is stuck in my mind from a commission meeting in April of 2020, when the president of Ethiopia came on. She'd just been watching BBC, which had a report about some school children in the United States and California going to a Pizza Hut parking lot to get Wi-Fi access so they could follow their online lessons. And she just said, this is happening in California. What are we going to do? And clearly, and I think the report's pretty consistent on it, the use of the global north and global south, in response to your question, Jill, is not to create these monoliths. It is to point to asymmetries. But then the report pretty consistently, asks us all to pay attention to inequalities within and across countries. So that's what I would just add on that. There was a question about the enclosures that might be useful to go into. I would just say, I think one of the most significant enclosures that we're confronting right now is the move of education, the displacement of education into domestic spaces. Sort of the winnowing away of sort of the publicness of education. Something that takes place in public spaces. So that to me would be an example. Someone in one of the questions was asking about enclosures. I don't know if others want to come in on enclosures that we face today.
Thank you so much, Noah. Dave, Inés, do you want to add anything?
Well, from the previous conversation, and I just had an idea when they were talking about treasure within and learning to know, do, and be. I had a conversation once with George Haddad, and he said apparently that Delors himself was thinking about a report at the time on teaching to know, teaching to do, teaching to be and become. So that actually was at one point an idea that UNESCO had. Would be interesting to follow up on that. Peter answered the north-south. I subaltern. I mean, I'm having these conversations too. I think but before I'll let somebody else take the thing on enclosures, but on funding, and I think it's important that we do address the fact that, okay, 3% of countries did a stimulus because of COVID. 3% of countries worldwide. Biggest crisis ever, right? 3%. So funding is a huge issue. Corporations, whether you want to pick the Pfizer Moderna guys and the amount of money that they earned, or if you want to take Bezos and the transportation guys and how little of that made its way down to the people who were actually going door to door and delivering. Or, so someone just walked to the door, so you're going to get some dog barking on this, but I really think the funding is the huge issue, and that's domestic resource mobilization. There's no way around a conversation on tax. There will not be a way to do this through innovative financing, through that little 5% where someone leverages someone and no one knows who put the first money in. These conversations are a waste of time. So if you find yourself on these, get off them as fast as you can and ask about the 95%, which is actually going to close the gap. During the pandemic, just teachers, one quick thing from teachers, we heard in the beginning, wow, it's so hard to be a teacher. They should make millions of dollars. We don't hear that so much anymore. Now we hear, get back to class, get back to school. Don't teach through a mask, do other things. So we lose, everybody's busy and we lose track of things. But I think a focus on funding, an equity audit of what the costs of this pandemic, of what it would take to achieve that kind of a vision for everyone, infrastructure, systems, training, all of it, and really have that up front in front of us and talk about the resources, I think is absolutely fundamental. And if we don't have those conversations, we'll be finding ourselves back here again. So.
If I may, Iveta, I wanted to also come back to global south, global north, and I'm with Jill here. I'm more comfortable with maybe decolonizing. I think we need to talk about power asymmetries. We need to talk about wealth inequalities, but I wouldn't say it's just north and south. And sometimes it is being played out as the north is wrong, the south is okay. And for those of us who live in the south, if you want quotation marks, there are several things that are going wrong here that are indigenous, if you want. No, and I also wanted to pick up Jana Goebbels' question about the role of indigenous knowledge and the alternative of indigenizing education. And I would say yes, but I would say we need to move towards a pluralism that doesn't have a blueprint, and I wouldn't go for romanticizing the indigenous. I think we need to have really, if you want, epistemic dialogues and alliances between epistemologies, but we need to really carefully scrutinize and what do each epistemology bring to our current challenges, And I would say we have to protect past achievements in each of these epistemologies, but also remain attentive to their shortcomings, their blind spots, and their suitedness to contribute to this situation. Some of the alternative worldviews, even if you want less harmful for the planet, are not exempt from similar human-centeredness of Western epistemologies or moral arrogance. Others are used to justify ideals of purity, of harmony, that might also be potentially very dangerous or exploitative of other beings. So I think we have to move carefully in that direction. I agree we need to decolonize knowledge, but I think we need to have really good and deep conversations about what that means.
Thank you so much, everybody. And we are running out of time. We just have a few minutes left, and just maybe wanted to circle back really quickly to one of the questions here for Stephen Weiner, who says that the future is here, just not evenly distributed, and that a lot of the practices are already happening in education systems that are beginning to embody aspects and values and ideas highlighted in the report and could serve as starting points. Particularly the ones that decenter the human, create more opportunities to learn with the world around us. And maybe on this note, in your closing remarks, I really wanted to maybe bring it back again to the role of research, the role of us as researchers in pushing that agenda forward. If from that perspective, in just 1 minute, what would be maybe the kind of top priority for kind of reconfiguring how we approach research, or what we do with research, or how we think about research agendas? We can maybe use that as also closing remarks from each of you. And start with Noah.
Sure. I really appreciate what Peter was saying earlier about, let's pay attention to some of the ways that science has moved forward recently, and would say that let's similarly pay attention to the ways that research can be a commoning activity, and it is a key part of building a new social contract for education. So that's simply it.
Thanks, Noah. Peter.
Yeah, my own would be to sort of invite people to unpack some of these very new and exciting concepts that are there in the report, like the knowledge commons, like the idea of the enclosures. What exactly do we mean by the enclosures? The idea of we spent a lot of time on the idea of commoning. Going into its grammar, the commons, commoning, noun, verb, etc. So I think I would invite people to actually look at some of these large concepts that in a sense give the report its moral force, and invite people to unpack them. I think knowledge commons is one, enclosures is another, because enclosures may be a word, but the moment you work backwards and you try and identify the causal processes that are producing them, you begin to expose the asymmetries that are existing and being reproduced in the system. So I would invite, and one last point. Yes, I think this came up in some of the earlier discussions about human-centeredness. I think one of the things that we spent a lot of time discussing is how we must move out of the anthropocentric frame within which and not just concede rights to other species, but to see us as part of a connected ecosystem. And I think that the implications of moving out of anthropocentrism is something that I think education needs to take on board and discuss and debate. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Inés or David, who would like to go next?
I can go. I would say I'm also very, very short, but I would say as researchers, I think we have to be simultaneously more modest about what we can do. I mean, because research does not necessarily translate immediately into policies or teaching. We need other mobilizations. We need to build alliances, broader alliances, but I think also, I mean, we have to be more modest, but I would say we also need to be more ambitious. I think language and discourse and knowledge are important. As Peter was saying, we need to unpack some of the language that is being used for talking about education. I think it has effects on what we do, on how we feel, on what we act, and on what we feel engaged with. So I think we have to work also. Research can contribute to this unpacking that Peter was saying, and also to providing different language. And I think the report does a very good job at that, because I think it is giving us another language for talking about education. And in that respect, I think it's a very welcome shift from learnification to some other language that we are trying to define, but has to do with a togetherness, with a publicness, with the intergenerational, with the future again, an uncertain future, but that we want to be more optimistic about it, and we want to have more hope. We haven't mentioned hope, but I think it's quite important too.
Wonderful, thank you, Inés. And Dave, you have the last word.
Oh, geez, thanks,
Dave's
Iveta.
word.
Dave's words, yeah. I really like the humility angle, and I don't know about you guys, but I spend a lot of time listening to a lot of bravado, mostly men, but a lot of people who've got the answer, and they've got the research that they've bundled together in a certain way to sell their product that's going to solve your problem or do something very easily and very cheaply. Yeah, these are the sort of snake oil salesmen of forever, and I think as a research community that is actually humble in terms of analyzing our own assumptions, our own politics, our networks, what we privilege, what we foreground, and really trying to be honest and humble in what we're trying to do on that side. But as activists, I agree with Inés. I think the time, if you haven't seen Don't Look Up, I mean, it's urgent. This is an urgent moment. Right. This is not a time for tweeting and, little things here and there. This is an urgent moment. This is a chance to put on the table an agenda, a conversation, an invitation to completely rethink how it is that we go about educating people, adults we didn't talk about, kids, early childhood, as a right that is funded, that is supported, that is a public good, that is out there, that is going to be contested, and it's going to be debated. And there are going to be those who will lose very much because of what we're going to expose and put forward. Those alliances Inés was talking about, those are absolutely essential. And I think research across groups that aren't uncommon groups coming together, finding these intersections in an intersectorial way, gives us hope, at a time where, if you're talking about Lebanon, kids haven't had school for more than 20 days in the last 3 years. Teachers haven't been paid for the last 7 months there, Afghanistan, Myanmar in the bush. So there are real problems. There are real issues in this world that we need to be very closely watching and speaking up about. And so fighting for the justice for our brothers and sisters there, for the we that everyone's been talking about. So I think I'll leave it at that. But thank you very much for the invitation. Fantastic to be with you all.
Thank you so much, everybody. Especially huge thanks to our panelists and all of the audience who joined us today and engaged also in such a thoughtful and meaningful discussion. I just wanted to mention that we will be following up with some of these conversations in our Learning Futures podcast, which is hosted by Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College here at ASU. And we will be inviting our panelists and people from the audience as well to join us. Each episode presents conversations with colleagues, researchers, education leaders, and other guests who share how they are thinking about and addressing the most pressing challenges about education futures. So I hope that you will join us for these discussions. And on this note, I would like to close our session today and thank again everybody for joining us and for participating so actively and thoughtfully in this discussion. Thank you.